Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and in the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature, of which we are a part, with deep gratitude to all the generations before us that have brought us to the present moment in the human journey, I want to welcome all of you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on day 2 of a 5-day program on parapsychology and the general domain of science and consciousness. I want to begin our program today by just noting the passing of one of our dear faculty who was the dean of our wisdom school for many years, Will Tagle, who passed into the next realm on Sunday evening, very peacefully, surrounded by his family and members of the Earth Tribe that he and his wife Judith had founded some 50 years ago. And I raise this not only to honor Will, but also to note that for Will, the most important thing that humans could do was to learn what he called the mother tongue. And that is the capacity of human beings to enter into intelligible communication with nature, in the awareness that the trees behind me are just as alive, just as intelligent, just as compassionate, just as emotional, just as empathetic, and just as capable of intelligent communication as humans are, except in a completely different way. You may know that the neural networks of trees is shaped exactly like the neural network in our own brain. And Will dedicated his life to teaching humans the domain of science and consciousness, how we, through extrasensory perception, we, through simple alignment of energetic qualities, could begin to commune and also intelligibly communicate with other species, including rocks. We had several courses at Ubiquity where Will would lead groups of people. I was participating in a number of them out into a massive rock called Enchanted Rock in Texas, over 100 million tons of solid granite that has been revered by indigenous peoples for 10,000 years as a sacred place. And we would sit on the rock all day. And the goal was to move from communion to intelligible communication. That's how dimensionalized nature is. So when we think of science and the very small little advances that we humans are insisting on making and quantifying what's real, what's empirically provable, let us hold that consciousness and nature has been doing this for millions and billions of years. And the great predicament of we humans is we're the only species outside the conversation. And so this week, we're trying to get into the conversation. We're trying to fathom how human beings, as cut off as we are, can enter into the great pleroma of consciousness and intelligence that permeates all of nature around us. So that's the introduction that I'd like to make today as we enter into our second day of this field of science and consciousness. Before we jump in and introduce our guest, let us just pause, as we always do as we begin our Humanity Rising sessions, and let us just take a few deep breaths, center ourselves in our bodies, aware that our bodies are nature, Let us attune ourselves with our hearts in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that we're alive, that we have the opportunity to deepen our immersion in consciousness. Thank you, everyone. I went to the rock while we were in our little meditation. Just imagine a 100 million ton block of granite, only a little fraction of which is showing above the Earth's surface. And sitting on that rock, feeling the totality of that mass of granite, knowing that it is as conscious as you are in a completely different way. And then setting the challenge for yourself. How do we communicate? That's a koan for consciousness. It's now my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Peter Mary, who has convened a number of programs on Humanity Rising. He's our Chief Innovation Officer, and he's really led us over the years as we've been developing ubiquity. It was Peter that came up with the name Humanity Rising when we launched in the spring of 2020. He's passionate about all things having to do with consciousness and parapsychology and the connections between science and consciousness. So Peter, welcome to Humanity Rising. I turn the program over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jim. You know, when you say I came up with the name, I'd reframe that slightly also in the spirit of, you know, what we're exploring this week, which is it's often I get insights early in the morning when you're in this kind of half dream state. And so I was just in one of those states contemplating, you know, this idea that we had for bringing in a number of speakers and things. And I was just kind of going, oh, I wonder what we should call it. And then pling, you know, it just downloaded. And I think, you know, that's what a lot of this is about this week, is how we access the natural intelligence that's out there anyway. You know, what are the states we need to enter to be able to just find the solutions to seemingly massively complex problems for our rational minds. The kind of sentence that comes into my head is where Winnie the Pooh, you know, also talks about himself being a bear of little brain. Well, it sounds like at some levels we're all bears of little brains until we choose to expand our bandwidth,
totally,
you know, beyond the rational mind to be able to access the intelligences that are out there. So that's really what this week is about. And we're on the second day. So yesterday we started with Jim Hickman and Stanley Krippner, two people who were involved in, you know, very early days of this work, and told some stories of their time there. Today we're with Callum Cooper, who is a part of the biggest parapsychology department in the UK, who's going to kind of give us a tour of the story of this domain over the years, right up to where we are now and the latest research that they're doing, which will feed in tomorrow, where we have a really cool little experiment, I guess, with this with the technology, where Adam has created a tarot reading system using in virtual reality using a random number generator. So he's going to talk us through that and show us how all of that works. And then Thursday with Roger Nelson, of course, who's been around for a long time from the Princeton work and developed this network of random event generator sensors that pick up shifts in the field globally when collective attention focuses. And then looking at some of the scientific developments with Wolfhard Janu on the last day there. So for today, welcome, Cal, to Humanity Rising. Great to have you with us. There you go.
Hello.
Hello. Very good. And yeah, I mean, I know when we chatted first, I was in the weird experience where we just transported all of the equipment across from Princeton to Yorkshire in the UK, and the lab and everything got set up there and all the resources. So it was a nice synchronicity that was the moment we were talking. And you started to tell me a bit of the work that you're doing at Northampton, some of the work you've done personally, some of the work your students were doing. And one of the insights I got during that conversation was, wow, there is so much amazing research going on that the public don't know about. And that was when I got this idea for what I've kind of bookmarked as weird.news, which is how we get some of this research that's often just ends up in academic journals and that not that many people might end up reading into the public domain as stories, that are digestible for people, so that the worldview that people have starts to shift, not just through some kind of somebody's opinion, but actually through proper research that's been done and is demonstrating, that the nature of our reality maybe isn't the way it is we were taught at school and that most of our culture assumes. So it was great that you were able to make the time to join us today. I know you've got your 3-year-old daughter running around as well, so may occasionally have some assistance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she'll be on hand.
But great. So Callum is going to he's got a presentation for us that kind of get us up to speed really on where we are now in this world and how he got involved. And then we'll have some time for some discussion afterwards. So as he's going along, feel free to drop questions and comments into the chat. Remember, when you do, under the 2, that you should select everyone, not just hosts and panelists, then everyone else gets to see your comments.
Yeah.
And Callum is happy for me to interrupt occasionally.
Absolutely.
If I do pick up comments or questions, and we want to intervene and have some discussion around them. So great. Thanks a million, Callum. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And that's absolutely it. I mean, I think we've all learned that if you want to explore certain aspects of science, going on the internet is going to give you a very skewed view depending on who wrote what's on the internet. When you want overviews, I mean, Encyclopedia Britannica was fantastic, but less and less people seem to be using it now for overviews of information, but it still is one of the best sources. But for parapsychology, we have things now like the Science Encyclopedia that have been generated by the Society for Psychical Research. But having talks like this, that is the important thing, to get some discussion flowing, understand where some of the first-hand sources are. Where is that data that this person is talking about? Not just their opinion or their observation. Where are these first-hand studies? And then knowing where they are and telling other people, especially if they've got a view that, well, that's never happened, or there's no evidence for that, or no one's ever been involved in that, which is complete nonsense. There's a lot of research that's gone into parapsychology. There's a lot of good evidence supportive of psi and extended consciousness. Ultimately, though, we're striving on the edge of science here and trying to look at ultimately what is consciousness and how does it operate, which is an extremely big question for humanity. And we're really dabbling with one of the biggest questions of all. It's not that easy for us as humans ourselves to tackle. But we're making a good start with very little funding and very little person power. Parapsychology has come some way. So I want to give you a little journey into this, essentially showing you some stepping stones of how parapsychology has progressed, and then bring you up to current day of what I'm doing and some of my thoughts. So by no means is this all the history. The history is absolutely vast, but I'm just giving you an idea of where it's been. So I'm just going to share screen with you and go back a couple of slides. Oops. Because I think that's advanced. I don't know why it started there. Apologies. So there we go. So we're going to look at some of my thoughts on advances in parapsychology and extended consciousness. So I'm based at the University of Northampton, as Peter said. I suppose we're one of the largest research departments in the world at present for parapsychology. We have about 15 members of staff in psychology, dedicated to parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, looking at religious and peak experiences, consciousness studies, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience, with many different overlaps to each other. There's about 40 members of staff involved in total in psychology and counseling psychology and psychotherapy. So we dominate quite a lot of the psychology space, I suppose. And our labs are also specifically dedicated to parapsychology use. We have perception labs, observation rooms, and as you'll see in this presentation more recently, we've gained a flotation tank as well. We used to be the Centre for the Study of Anomalous Psychological Processes. Back in 1996, some of the University of Edinburgh graduates, Professor Deborah Delanoy, Dr. Simon Sherwood, and Professor Chris Rowe, ended up at the University College Northampton, as it was then, and they started a third-year optional module in parapsychology for psychology students and formed that centre for research. In more recent years, as we progressed to this new campus, which you'll see here, we're now at Waterside campus in the University of Northampton, in Northampton. We now have a group called Exceptional Experiences and Consciousness Studies, which has integrated some of those researchers from cognitive psychology and neuroscience as well, which is very much needed because parapsychology is certainly going in the direction now of integrating neuroscience into its research, which I really think are the next stepping stones for where parapsychology is going. We've got so much data on statistical tests of psi and qualitative data from day-to-day observations of people's alleged psychic experiences. If people are having these experiences or they can produce certain phenomena, what is actually going on in the brain? So that really is our next step. I've mentioned parapsychology a few times already, but I've not defined it. So here we go. Parapsychology is the scientific study of experiences which, if they are as they seem to be, are in principle outside of the realm of human capabilities as presently conceived by conventional scientists. Do you want to help? I knew this would happen. So overall, the phenomena is coined as psi-type phenomena, but it breaks down into three different areas: ESP, PK, and survival. And so what are these? Well, ESP was coined by Joseph Banks Rhyme, who we'll talk about in a little bit as we progress through the slides. It stands for extrasensory perception, and it can involve telepathy, mind-to-mind interaction, clairvoyance, an ability to see information at distance, and precognition, a feeling or feeling physical discomfort, things like that, that we might act on, changes our behaviour, and later we realise why, or distinct visions or dreams about something before it happens. And Chuck Honiton also talked about ESP being error-some place. We know that these experiences, we have an initial reaction and then an outcome, but where is this experience coming from? Or is it due to some conventional explanation that we've overlooked as well? So where is that error within the system? Right, okay. What's that? Psychokinesis, PK, it's also known as telekinesis as well. I suppose made popular by the rise of Uri Geller and then the mini Gellers after that, so manipulating metal allegedly with the mind alone. But this can involve micro PK, so small deformations in objects, structures, or even biological systems as well. So something we wouldn't be able to see with the naked eye. We could have a strip of metal wired up to piezoelectrical sensors or strain gauges, and the computer will tell us if, when someone is told to will the metal to bend, if indeed it is under strain. But we won't be able to see that with our eyes. Macro PK, so very clear physical deformations, much like the cutlery bending before our eyes. RSPK, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. So this is what we see within poltergeist type activity. So chairs, furniture, objects moving, writing on the walls that people can see, and it's occurring again and again over a period of time, usually within a set location. And then the third area that parapsychology deals with is survival. So this could involve mediumship, suggesting the mind surviving outside of the body or beyond bodily death, mediumship, someone channeling information, believing they're hearing the sounds of the dead or distinct visions, things like that. Apparitions, near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, past lives, reincarnation type experiences, and there are many more. We could have hauntings in there, poltergeist type phenomena, electronic voice phenomena, instrumental transcommunication, so people believing that they're gaining communication over electrical devices. And also, I suppose, actual death experiences. So when someone has gone beyond the near-death experience and they've been dead for more than 6 minutes, which is usually the time in which that we would have for the brain to remain healthy upon revival through CPR. So there are some rare accounts of people being dead for several hours, or sometimes even being in a morgue cooler and being taken out for autopsy and waking up and saying that they remembered everything that happened within that interim. So those are interesting. There's a very good book that discusses some of those called The Art of Dying by Peter Fenwick and Elizabeth Fenwick as well. And then ADCs as well, so after-death communications, which we've been doing a lot of work on at the University of Northampton. So some of these surround bereavement type phenomena, but people can have after-death communications with people, deceased individuals that they don't know. They're not friends, they're not relatives. It's only after their experience they discover who that person was. So why should we be interested in these experiences? Well, many people report these experiences and more still believe that such anomalous processes and agencies might actually be genuine. There's something new for science to learn. Many surveys have been done over time. Here's one example from Elenda Haraldson, where over 60% of people have responded in the affirmative to having them. But if you go back to the early days of the Society for Psychical Research, their first major survey was called On the Senses of Hallucinations, that came out in volume 10 of their proceedings. In that, they sent over 17,000 postal correspondence out to people, asking them if they'd had psychical type experiences, and 10,000 people responded in the affirmative. And so updated surveys over time have shown that large amounts of people will report these experiences. Some people become very concerned about their experiences. Others report that such experiences have changed their lives. 50 to 60% of the bereaved report having these experiences. Some surveys have even gone up to 90. Through Rupert Sheldrake's research, 1 in 4 people claim to have had at least one telepathic type experience in their life that they can recall. I'm sure, hang on, baby, hang on. I'm sure many of you can also relate to experiences such as telephone telepathy. You might have been thinking about a friend or a relative that you haven't spoken to in a long time. The telephone rings and you think, well, I think that might be them. And upon picking it up, it does turn out to them. It's not a regular call. Yes. 1 second, she wants to sit with me with a blanket. Peter, you can take over for a second.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, sorry about the bars here. It's because we've got the video and sound enhancement activated, because he's got some videos in the presentation, which means these gray bars show up for us for some reason. So just so you're aware, Carl, like the last bullet point we can't read because there's a gray bar covering it, for example.
No, that's the, I'll remove that. That's the instruction bar, hide the, there we go. That might have gone now.
There we are, that's gone. And now we've got a bar in the middle of the screen.
Yeah, all Zoom interfaces display this gray bars that you're sharing.
Okay, that's better, Carl. We've only got one at the very top of the screen now, so the rest is okay. Yeah.
Okay, that's just another one regarding sound. Never mind, it's gone. So it says at the bottom there, these experiences are highly common. And this is why Rupert has also said that, you know, it's not right that people refer to these experiences as paranormal. If they're in the majority of people reporting them, then they're normal. The same for supernatural. Why? They seem to be perfectly natural. Many people report them, many people can relate to them. What is paranormal, what is supernatural, are why we have this minority of people that don't seem to ever be able to relate to these experiences. And so what's going on there? So this is also why psychology comes into play, as to what is it about the people that report these experiences, their education, their belief systems, their background, and so forth, that might relate to why they do and don't have these experiences and how they interpret them as well. So how did this all come about as a science? Well, it all began really in the late 1840s with the Fox sisters, who were claiming clicking noises and raps about the family household, and saying that they were essentially getting in contact with the deceased. It was all to do initially with a person who'd formerly lived in their household, who died. There was a murder related to the whole scenario. But their abilities extended beyond that story, and they started traveling around as mediums, displaying their abilities. Initially, two of the sisters, and then the eldest sister, who'd already grown up and moved away, got involved as well. But many people, and I suppose the newspapers, were reporting on people seeing ghosts, and apparitions, and reporting mediumistic abilities. Psychical research groups were formed. By 1860, there was the British Ghost Club. But by 1882, scholars at Trinity College, University, Cambridge, had got together, Frederick Myers, Henry Sidgwick, Frank Podmore, Edmund Gurney, and many others, and formed the Society for Psychical Research to actually look from the viewpoint of psychology, physics, philosophy, theology, and various other disciplines, what is actually going on here? Do all of these experiences fit within conventional knowledge, or is something new going on? By 1884, 1885, the American Society for Psychical Research was formed, in some ways to try and debunk what the British SPR were doing, saying that no, definitely, there are some explanations here that science can put its hand to. Very eminent people were involved in that formation, including William James, the psychologist, the famous American psychologist. But within 10 years of their formation, they were pretty much on the same grounds as the SPR, discovering that, yes, we can find conventional explanations for a number of experiences, but some don't seem to fit the bill. There are some instances of mediumship where we can't figure out why they're coming out with such specific information, for example, or why when someone has seen this apparition again, the apparition has delivered specific information about their life or something, or multiple witnesses have been present. The Rhine Revolution. So there was this period of time with the Societies for Psychical Research. The Rhines are also members of the American branch, and they'd been to many seances in their time. Their background was in botany, the University of Chicago. They both did their PhDs in that. Joseph Banks Rhine had initially been interested in pursuing a career in the church in his early time, but got involved in biology and was interested for a long time in psychical research. And it was the social scientist William McDougall, who they were friends with, who was involved in psychical research, had been given a position as Dean of Psychology and the Social Sciences at Duke University in the 1920s, and asked the Rhines to go with him and form their own department of psychical research, but make it distinct, start to give psychical research some standpoint as a science. So both the Rhines, they had that strong spiritual interest. They had some good grounding in statistics, but by the time they got to Duke University, they got statisticians involved with them. They've been unimpressed with mediumship. In some instances where they got famous people along to some of the seances, that they thought, actually, if we get, their backing as well, something good could come of this. They even had one particular seance where Albert Einstein was present with a couple of research assistants for a medium who had apparently displayed some very interesting phenomena. When Albert Einstein turned up, nothing happened. And so it was a very disappointing outcome. Rhine, I think, was still interested in these types of phenomena, but he needed to develop some sort of consistent method for testing ESP. The term that he came out with, extrasensory perception. If people are having these psychic experiences day to day, then surely there's a way, a system in which we can actually put good methods to this, repetitive methods that anyone could try and demonstrate that something is going on in a controlled environment. So that's what they were trying to achieve at Duke University. This is where these cards came in, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. These were the Zener Cards, or Zener, different pronunciations depending on British or American for these, but Carl Zener developed these. He was interested in, what was he? He was a professor of perceptual studies, and he looked at these basic symbols as something that would be easy to remember. You've got a sequence of 1 to 5, so a continuous line for the circle, 2 lines for the cross, 3 wavy lines for the wavy lines, 4 sides to a square, and 5 points to a star. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They changed one of the symbols initially, and the Rhines had also worked with packs of playing cards. It was quite difficult for the people involved. Now, they tested all sorts of people, members of staff, visitors, students, professed psychics, and they'd done these studies again and again and again, where there are 5 of these cards in every pack, 25 in a pack, and therefore, if you're just going through these shuffled, trying to guess what's on the other side of them, you should get at least 5 out of 25 by chance, maybe 6. It allows for 1 standard deviation beyond that chance in a pack of 25. And so they did these again and again. People were going through hundreds and then thousands of trials. And Ryan was trying to find his best scorers ultimately, but they'd also tried different things. They'd looked at children, they'd looked at the blind, they'd looked at distance, they'd look at various stimulants, caffeine, alcohol, and so on, to see if there were any differences that were made. But it was all in the hopes of pushing this standard methodology, getting statisticians involved to also show how simple the mathematics could be behind this. So to introduce a progressive program of research based on sound methodology, to gain academic status and scientific recognition for the field, to show that psychic ability was widespread rather than the preserve of the select few. For example, everyone can run. If you're able-bodied, you can run. If we say just run down there, we'll do a 100 meters run, everyone could go down that line. Some people will run faster than others, though. Some people will have different running styles. And so by testing people in this way, you can see who is a good high ESP scorer and who isn't, and what are the differences between those people. The first significant series came out in 1931 to 1932. 24 students gave 270 hits in 800 trials, and the mean chance expectancy was 160. The significance level was absolutely massive. The procedure evolved to prevent any normal communication as well. So they were looking for any kind of errors in their methodology, what we might call sensory leakage, possibilities of them knowing the sequence. They were starting to use electric card shufflers, they'd use shielding, and they were developing many methods that now standard psychology uses across the board. So randomization, the shielding, blind testing, double blind testing, triple blind testing, and then later on meta-analyses as well. All things that came out of parapsychology, especially significance testing as well. So we work in psychology in general, a standard significance of 0.05. If you're doing a statistical study, you're looking to see if it can beat a 1 in 20 chance of it likely being down to the actual anomaly you're looking at, rather than just being chance or a fluke or some other artifact. So they're already gaining that recognition and finding that something was going on. They published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology and Social Psychology and a few other places, but these mainstream places weren't particularly interested. It's not as though they got any backlash. It was more so that they didn't get any feedback really at all. And so they needed to develop something that was more in-house and gain some more traction, because trying to go beyond the scope of psychical research and parapsychology, giving psychical research that name parapsychology, that they just needed that more awareness out there to gain scientific recognition. You mentioned having Stan Krippner on as well. Ryan was traveling all over the place talking about the research that they were doing. And indeed, Stan Krippner, as a young student, was involved on a student board to get guest lecturers in. And where Stan was based, he suggested to the psychology faculty, so his peers, his seniors, these members of staff, let's get JB Ryan. And there were several people who were dead against it because they found the idea of psychic functioning so controversial. And they had all these negative things to say. And he said, well, what if we don't pay him anything? What if he comes under his own steam? We're not giving him any fees. You know, I could personally sort out his travel. And what if it doesn't come out of the faculty then? And so they did allow him to come along. It was packed. They had about 1,000 people attend the lecture. I think it was standing room only, and people were sat on the stairs of the lecture theatre, absolutely fascinated with what Ryan had to say. Some of these members of the faculty turned up, but never challenged Ryan, never approached him or said all these negative things that they had to say in private, and never were able to say it to him in person. And yet he answered some very challenging questions that were brought up. This happened time and time again, where people had some criticism to say, and yet when they were faced with the person doing the research, doing the groundwork, they never seemed to face them and challenge them with these very repetitive or stale arguments that didn't really seem to apply, but they were very firm with the answer, and therefore there is no such thing as ESP. It's not going on. So there's a whole psychology to learn there of those certain individuals. So extrasensory perception was the first monograph that came out that published these series of studies that they'd done at Duke University. And it was published by the Boston Society for Psychic Research. And it got picked up. It was reviewed by the New York Times. Really good review. The science editor for that was also very pro-parapsychology, which was a very good start. And it instantly got republished as well. It created more attention following national magazines and national radio broadcasts. People started writing to the Rhines at Duke University and ringing them every hour of day or night, telling them about their experiences wanting to be tested. So it really helped for public interest and also educational interest as well. It was showing that Duke University was a place in which these studies were being taken seriously. Further development though, even though they were publishing in these other journals, they needed their own in-house journal. There were the journals of psychical research, but parapsychology needed its own establishment. So they developed a peer-reviewed journal, Journal of Parapsychology, which came out, first of all, in 1937, with one of its main editors being William McDougall, who also provided the editorial introduction to the first issue. That's still going to this day. It used to be published every quarter. Now it's biannually produced, but it's still a peer-reviewed journal. Another good thing that came out of parapsychology later down the line with the European Journal of Parapsychology was pre-registration. The fact that before you do a study, you submitted the very methods you intended to do. So they got scrutinized for whether they would actually be a good procedure to carry out. So it was only once you passed pre-registration would you then carry out the study with the intention of publishing it in that journal. They needed an organization for professional parapsychologists as well. So they developed the Parapsychological Association in 1957. That's not to be confused with the Parapsychology Foundation, which was developed in 1951, established by the famous medium Eileen Garrett. Both of those still exist to this day, but the PA, Parapsychological Association, came out of the Rhines and Duke University. They also gained affiliation. They tried several times, but by 1969 they achieved it with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Still the case today that they're an affiliate, much to the disgruntlement of some members who were dead against it, didn't want parapsychology to be part of it. But there was an overwhelming majority of hands up at the time. It went through a number of barriers that other areas didn't have to, but so many members were in agreement that it did satisfy the regulations of being a science by its very methods of what it was doing, whether or not people believed or accepted the very phenomena that it was studying. So it was really good that it got that recognition. Oh, what is there? What's that? I could see another box. Hang on. Can you see this box in the middle? Please remove this window.
Please move this window away from the shared application. It says. I don't know if you're able to.
No idea. Can you guys do that your end?
I don't think so. Oh, it's fading now. It's fading now.
What on earth is that?
Who knows?
Spooky.
Oh, it's coming back.
Let me...
Maybe if you just kind of closed the presentation and started,
yeah,
that might help. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, I'll start sharing again. Clearly, my presentation's that good. She's listening all the way. Sorry, guys. Let's get back to this. Here we go. So that's the main journey that I'll just close that. Right.
Yeah, it's got
that's
rid of
the main.
One.
Yeah, the one in the middle disappeared as well.
That one.
And so I mentioned those points at the bottom. So the other criticism that parapsychology gets is also the file draw problem. This idea that, well, if there are good data out there, it's only because of the file draw problem. You're doing all these studies, and those that don't have a success, they never reach publication. You don't submit them. And so those are the part of the iceberg that we don't see under the water. There could be some studies that are submitted that might have null data. It's not finding anything, but they don't reach publication either through the parapsychology journals or journals further afield. And those that are successful, well, those are the published ones. That's why we're seeing that there are some successful studies out there. But our view is that there aren't really overall, and there isn't an effect going on. That's the main problem here. And actually, you've skewed your own field by suggesting that something is going on. And yet, the various statistical analyses that have been developed over time for the social sciences, including what I mentioned, parapsychology developing, the meta-analyses, are so important. You could take a number of parapsychology studies that have demonstrated something and a number that have demonstrated nothing, they didn't find anything, and then apply meta-analyses, put all of those similar studies on that same topic of parapsychology together, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis, healing, whatever it may be, and subject it to that. And there was a recent paper, 2018, by Etzel Cardenia. It came out in American Psychologist. There's a whole story there with responses to it that were just, in my view, balmy, the unusual responses, very questionable responses that didn't come back with evidence. It just came back with thoughts and criticism. But what Etzel had presented were various meta-analyses that showed that, look, in all of these areas, the overall outcome is good. It's a good outcome. It's still significant, showing all these successes and failures. And so this is good. This is comparable to the rest of psychology, if not stronger than some areas of psychology as well. If we were to accept this whole idea of the file draw, this idea that actually there's a vast number of studies that were unsuccessful that were just never published, it would require a vast number of studies to be published, and we could only guesstimate what that number would be. But what you also have to understand is that there are very few scientists worldwide and over time that have been involved in parapsychology compared to other areas of science, and there is very little funding involved, and not to mention the criticism behind getting involved in it. And so a lot of people carry out studies either under their own steam or with a very small bit of funding we might call seed corn funding, where a few hundred to a few £1,000s. And so whatever study you do, whatever the outcome, you better get it published, because the funders are expecting some results on what little income that you had for it. And so there's no point in wasting your time to do the study and then not do anything with it. It could take a year to complete one study, or maybe even several for just the purpose of one study. I've been involved in some pilot studies where it took us about 3 to 4 years to get them done on a few £100s. And so we were going to publish it no matter what the outcome. There was no point in not doing it. It's a big assumption to make to say that parapsychology has, for a long time, just been putting in the file drawer all of its non-findings. There's also the problem that parapsychology journals have, against other journals, they've always had this policy of publishing null findings and replications. Wider journals, let's call them mainstream, and I hate using that term, there's a lot of journals that, one, won't accept a study if it's a replication. There was a big problem there with Daryl Bem's study on precognition, where it went in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, got a lot of media attention and stir. And then when a replication was done by Chris French and Richard Wiseman that didn't find anything, they couldn't get it in the same journal because it was a replication and it was a non-finding as well. So both of those are faux pas for mainstream journals. And I think that can also skew sometimes the bigger picture and the story that's being told by scientists when we have journals that have those kinds of policies. Parapsychologists just want a complete open honesty, all cards on the table when it comes to that. So what's happened since Duke University? Well, it's increased acceptance at various universities worldwide for undergraduate and postgraduate studies. It's created taught courses, taught modules on parapsychology through to research degrees being accepted. This was also massively helped by the establishment of the Koestler Parapsychology Unit at the University of Edinburgh. Its first chair that was appointed was Professor Bob Morris. He alone, besides his taught classes on parapsychology within psychology and various staff members that helped out, under his leadership within that, he'd seen around 34 PhD candidates through the system at the University of Edinburgh in parapsychology topics. And there was also Dr. Dr. John Belloff, who was a reader in psychology there. I think he'd seen about 4 or 5 PhDs in parapsychology through as well. He was at Edinburgh slightly before Bob Morris and also continued there as well. Parapsychology's application to other fields as well. We've seen overlaps to anthropology, thanatology, so the study of death and dying, physics, biology, neuroscience, evolutionary theory, and many other areas as well. We can see it can be integrated into all kinds of areas of science and various aspects of psychology. It also plays a key role in consciousness studies, especially when we've looked at the Ganzfeld and altered states of consciousness, say through psychedelic reactants or meditation, for example. I'll give you some insight into that. And then also the emergence of anomalistic psychology, something that Professor Chris French has pushed at Goldsmiths University. So let's look at all the aspects of psychology we already know and understand, even belief systems, that would lead people to assume that they're having a psychic experience. But let's not leave out the idea that some people might approach us claiming an ability, or we want to test an ability. We're still open to that. Whereas parapsychology pushes the other side. We're aware of all these conventional explanations and what looks like paranormal when it's not, but parapsychology is more keen in doing the testing of the claims rather than the other side. It just takes those on board. Anomalistic psychology is interested in exploring what's paranormal when actually it's not. Let's look at all the things that make people assume they're having an experience. And clinical parapsychology. So regardless of where that experience has come from, whether it's something new to learn or not, we are interested in that. But what does it do for someone? When you have a telepathic experience, how does it make you feel? When you have a sense of presence of the deceased, how does that make you feel following loss? What does it do to your health psychology, your positive psychology, to have a parapsychological experience? These are just a few universities alone within the UK that support parapsychology. We've got Greenwich there, Goldsmiths, Derby, Manchester Metropolitan University, Edinburgh, Bucks-New University, Northumbria, Leeds, Beckett, and of course the University of Northampton. Those are just a few. I haven't put them all down, but it's just to show how widespread it is now and how accepted it is at many universities. Even the University of Cambridge has a slight hat tip to it. We have people like Dr. Andreas Sommer, who's back there as a scholar of the history of psychology, who's got a big background in psychical research and parapsychology and involves that in his classes. The archive of the Society of Psychical Research is still there at the library that you can request to go and view various items whenever you like as well. They're very proud of that collection. So it's very widespread. I mentioned these experiences as well, the sense of presence of the dead. So this brings us up to present day. What are we doing at the University of Northampton? Well, my first PhD was very much geared towards this, looking at post-death experiences and how it impacts on our positive psychology. We've been doing this now continuously since, I suppose, 2012, but our biggest project, which is now with Evelyn and David and Chris and myself, kicked off in 2018 when we received continuous funding from places like BL to look at these experiences and do larger surveys. So the largest survey, besides what the SPR had done, I mentioned that Census of Hallucinations in the 1880s, 17,000 postal correspondence. There was a study done for the British Medical Journal in 1971 by a general practitioner called William Dewi Rees. And it was part of his medical doctorate at King's College London. And he'd interviewed 293 widows and widowers about their experiences and found that over 50% of people reported sense of presence phenomena through apparitions. So we updated this and we sent out surveys, very detailed surveys that took about 45 minutes to complete, of varying aspects of these experiences. And we had them in English, Spanish, and French. They're just about to go into German and Dutch as well. But from the 3 languages alone, we collected over 1,000 respondents in the survey, which was really, really good, and then had this broken down into a paper we published in the British Journal of Psychiatry Open, which is open access. You take that title, the phenomenology and impact of hallucinations concerning the deceased. You can look that up online and read that paper. But it is one of several. We're doing all kinds of contributions on different areas of this. We're looking at group experiences. We're looking at messages received. We've looked at purely the senses that people report, that sense of presence, dreaming of the dead. There's so many aspects of what people reported and the categories that we developed in the survey to individually take out, analyze, and write up. So it's a really big study for us. Oh, that's squashed off. But if you want to look at some of those summaries of our papers and online talks that we've done, go to www.adcrp.org. That's the official website that was set up for our research there. During the time of doing this last year, we were fortunate that the aerospace entrepreneur, Robert Bigelow, set up an essay competition for the best evidence for consciousness surviving beyond permanent bodily death in a 25,000 word essay. I think 209 essays got accepted, and initially there were only 3 places. So the first prize was $500,000, second $300,000, and third $150,000. And they got so many good essays. They then did some runner-up prizes of $50,000, and then special acknowledgements mentioned for $20,000. We got a special mention. We got an acknowledgement for ours. This was written again by Evelyn, David, Chris, and myself. We went out to Las Vegas, saw all the presentations, and we got a plaque from that. And that also incorporated so much of what we'd done on the after-death communications. But I'd also written little bits in there on evidence from hauntings, also Psych experiences within the funeral industry. Why is it that funeral directors and coroners have these experiences when there is no emotional attachment there to the deceased? They're doing a job, and this is a consistent day-to-day thing. So why might they have experiences seeing of apparitions that they're not aware of, or sense of presence phenomena? So this has taken us in all kinds of direction. And the research is also extremely helpful for the bereaved. It's got parapsychological qualities with these messages received that are specific and these group experiences. But just knowing about this research really does help the bereaved. It's very therapeutic to know about it. Going back 10 years, though, when I was an undergraduate, I got involved in remote viewing research with Chris Rowe, where we looked at military techniques for remote viewing and also Ganzfeld techniques. So Ganzfeld there on the left, where you see all that red light, and then we'd send the same participant through using these military-based techniques for looking at grid references and then developing drawings. That was published in the Journal of Parapsychology, along with several other replications that Chris had done. I can find you the link for that if you're interested. But more recently, around about, I suppose about 2013, 2014, we've been mentioning at Society for Psychical Research conferences and other places, wouldn't it be fun if a university got a flotation tank? And people would laugh about it, but I didn't see why it was so funny. I thought the idea was good. To try a flotation tank instead of Ganzfeld, where you're relaxing in a chair and you've got eye shields and red light beaming down on you, to try and move away from the feelings and sensations of the body and get yourself lost in all your inner thoughts and see if they relate to a particular target that someone's trying to send to you or a target location. So I came up with the idea that, well, why don't we just, with a little bit of funding from the SPR, rent time in a flotation tank and do a pilot study based on the same procedure we use in Ganzfeld. So Dr. David Saunders and myself started to do that. I went to a flotation tank centre, that's me in the blue, in Nottingham, and we started to produce our pilot study. I wrote about my very first experiences in the magazine of the SPR. That's what the tank looked like. This was a big commercial tank. They're about £25,000 or so, with rooms specially made for them. Did these in 2016. We did about 12 trials. And while I was in there looking at all these, interacting with these hallucinations that I had for an hour, David Saunders would be in Northampton viewing a randomly selected video clip that I was trying to pick up on. And then all of my drawings and thoughts would be written down afterwards. And the trial number would get submitted with that to an independent judge, who'd then score up, well, out of a series of 4 video clips where one of them was the target, which one did they perceive the target to be based on my drawings and mentations. This all began in the 1950s with John Lilly. He was looking at sensory deprivation, and he was one of the people who pioneered the flotation tank. So that's another direction you guys could go in. You might want to look at what John Lilly was doing. But this is how the setup looked. This one I really liked. This was one that we actually got wrong, where I was doing judging as well as an independent judge. And I really liked this one. I'd done these drawings here where I thought, well, it really jolted me when I saw this image. It's a jellyfish, a mushroom, or a hot air balloon. And I looked at all 4 video clips. And when I saw this particular video clip, I thought, well, it has to be that one. Alas, it wasn't. It was one of the other video clips, but that's also what we have explored in parapsychology called displacement. Because that target was in a pool of potentials, had I picked up on the fact that for that trial it was there. It's just not the target we're meant to be focusing on. This one was really good though. This is one where I'd done these drawings of and written about cogwheels and lots of cars and a bridge over water. I got this as a hit. I was correct in my selection of this video clip, and so was the independent judge.
You don't like it? No, I don't like it. She complicated and left me a mule to ride. She complicated and left me a mule to ride.
That one usually wows people. So because we published a pilot study, we got it in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research. We then started to seek funding. So we got funding from the Garrett Scholarship that's still through Trinity College, Cambridge. And also BL has given us some funding as well. But we put that funding together that constituted about 3.5 years worth of funding. And we've afforded ourselves a PhD student out of that. So Kirsty Allen is now a PhD student, primarily working on Psych studies to do with the flotation tanks. And we also had some departmental funding that we bid for. It was only £5,000. It was enough to afford us one of these, which is a Zen flotation tank. So it's an affordable flotation tank where we set it up, it inflates, we fill it up with the water, it heats up the water, we dilute the Epsom salt in there to get the buoyancy, and we've stuck it in the sports facility, so we've got the showers nearby. So this is the flotation tank that Kirsty's going to be using for her participants. It's already set up now. Give you a tester there. Look, that was me about a month or so ago, just after we'd set it up, just making sure the buoyancy was right. It's all ready to go. And Kirsty's also tried out some of the commercial flotation tanks as well, because there are the ones like you saw that I used, and there's also whole float rooms, an entire room where the floor goes down and it's filled up with the water. And they might have little LEDs in the ceiling or things like that, but usually you have to float in darkness. That's where our studies are going. We've got PhD students working on things like diet and psi phenomena, looking at veganism and vegetarianism and fasting. We've got studies on mediumship from the viewpoint of the sitters, from the viewpoint of the medium, looking at after-death communications in the elderly, spontaneous experiences during COVID and lockdown for bereavement related to these apparitions and sense of presence phenomena. People that have also been working on psychedelics and transpersonal type experiences. We've got many studies on the go right now. Such variety, it's wonderful. I've got 8 PhD students with 7 of them focused on parapsychology. So we really are doing a lot of things, and we've got a lot of variety, and we can support a variety of studies as well. I've also got students coming in looking at the psychology of disbelief in this kind of data, and also how people have interacted online with this. I think Anne Davies is in on the session as well. She is an art historian, and she's looked at spiritualist art and how these could be an aspect of survival evidence, where people have done drawings and paintings, artwork of deceased individuals they don't seemingly know, but through their mediumship they've done them. Do they relate to photographs or what people say of these deceased individuals? It's an aspect of history and psychical research history that hasn't had enough written on it. So there's a lot of beautiful research going on, and from historical aspects to modern day studies. I'll skip this. These are just arguments about, is it a standard science, or what's parapsychology's place in science? There are so many arguments for it. I think mainly the arguments against it, or saying parapsychology is a pseudoscience, are just extremely weak. And even though we see those on the internet now, you can even ask me that question as to why I see it that way. But I think they are very weak and wanting explanations when people say that it's pseudo. I think they actually mean that the topic is pseudo via their belief system. They believe that telepathy is bunk. They believe that ghosts are bunk. People don't have these experiences, but that's making many assumptions as well. To call a whole science that decides to explore why people have these experiences is very far-fetched, because science is based on method. It's based on a standard method and also a standard method of analysis as well. And what parapsychology uses was either developed and now integrated into the rest of social sciences, or it uses other aspects of social science methodology applied to these experiences. It is no different. It's just a strand of psychology. And so if that's pseudo, so is psychology. So is the rest of pseudo. So is the rest of social science. It's making a massive assumption, or calling individuals pseudo scientists based on the fact that they're studying these aspects as well. Well, that also then brings psychology on the whole into a lot of questioning as well. All kinds of arguments are brought up, such as the replication problem and all sorts, that I could go on and on about that being a wider spread issue than just parapsychology. Is it a standard science? I like this quote here from Dean Radin's book, Real Magic, in which he quoted Jessica Utt's presidential address to the American Statistical Association about her work and viewpoint on this. And I'll read out this quote. This is what she said. She got a brilliant standing ovation for her talk here. Even though she's just speaking to an audience of statisticians, she brought in her time on parapsychology and how that overlapped to statistics. Just checking the sleeping angel. For many years, I have worked with researchers doing very careful work in parapsychology, including a year that I spent full-time working on a classified project for the United States government to see if we could use these abilities for intelligence gathering during the Cold War. At the end of that project, I wrote a report for Congress that's stating what I still think is true. The data in support of precognition and possibly other related phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if it pertained to something more mundane. Yet most scientists reject the possible reality of these abilities without ever looking at data. And on the other extreme, there are true believers who base their beliefs solely on anecdotes and personal experience. I have asked the debunkers if there is any amount of data that would convince them, and they generally have responded by saying probably not. I asked them what original research they have read, and they mostly admit that they haven't read any. Now, there is a definition of pseudoscience, basing conclusions on belief rather than data. When I've given talks on this topic to audiences of statisticians, I showed them lots of data. Then I asked the audience which would be more convincing to you, lots more data or one strong personal experience. Almost without fail, the response is one strong personal experience. I think people are justifiably skeptical because most people think that these abilities contradict what we know about science. They don't, but that's a subject for a different talk. And I think I would have to agree with Jessica on that point. I'm not specifically pinpointing these individuals, but they're just examples that there's a lot of skewed opinion amongst this is something Peter was mentioning at the start, amongst the population, because of what we see in the media or what we see on the internet. When we see a popular TV skeptic or someone talking about early spiritualism or psychic phenomena saying mediums are bad because they just take money off the bereaved and they're tricking them, it's a very evil process, or I'm sorry, there's no such thing as ghosts, they just defy the laws of thermodynamics, they're not possible, no one's ever experienced them, it's making a massive sweeping assumption and saying that data isn't there or nothing empirical has been done in very good controlled settings, when in fact it has. There's so much data sat around me now regarding this and that history. When someone is given a platform who's not involved in parapsychology or consciousness studies, but is representing a science or skepticism and has that platform, it's so dangerous because then it convinces an audience that I've heard from that authority, they should know, and yet they've said it's not happening. So I don't need to look into this further, and that will be my argument as well. I'll just repeat what they said. You know, just missing research out of hand. Some of these people have no involvement in the research. They have no in-depth knowledge of the literature or none at all. And it also creates these false public perceptions of the evidence as well. This is not to say that such individuals that make these statements have no contribution to make. They most certainly would have, were they wanting or able or willing to get involved, or even just get involved in dialogue, you know, an open debate on stage, on platform, or in a webinar just like this. But unfortunately, sometimes we'll see them answer a question based on this that someone's asked, or they do have a temporary platform to talk about these things, and we don't necessarily get the correct view or the authoritative view that we would actually like an audience to hear. Regarding some of those issues and misperceptions and how they get out there in the public, I would recommend two books. One is Randy's Prize by Robert McLuhan, and more recently Craig Weiler, who's looked at issues of the internet and misinformation. He's looked at the James Randi Prize as well, the $1 million for anyone that could demonstrate psychic functioning within a controlled setting or repetition of it, and also banned TED Talks. regarding psychic phenomena and telepathy, one of the most famous ones being Rupert Sheldrake's banned TED Talk, and why it became banned. But these problems don't just exist regarding the internet and the media. There have been editors of journals that don't like the topic, so will dismiss a paper on parapsychology just at the editor's desk without sending it out for peer review. Or even some of the peer reviewers just not liking the topic. Ultimately, we're humans dealing with humans. So it's not necessarily that some of these studies are bad, it's just that they get given to people that don't like the idea of them. So they never get to see the light of day in that particular publication. They actually go somewhere else. Whatever journal it was submitted for in the first place probably would have been the best platform for it. So we're constantly against this struggle. And I don't think it's parapsychology alone. There'll be other areas of science that suffer this as well. But certainly because of its controversial nature and how the public have reacted to it over time, when actually we should treat it as normal, we should treat it as natural, and just try and understand what is going on. Is there anything new to learn, or isn't there? And if there isn't, why are people having these experiences? That's where that anomalistic psychology comes in. So absolutely check out these books. I contributed a forward to this second edition by Craig Weiler, giving my own thoughts and perceptions, teaching on parapsychology at university, and what I see with new generations of students coming in and their opinions on these. We also do outreach to the media as well. I was involved in the Christmas special and series 2 of Paranormal Captured. I've done ITVs this morning talking about day-to-day experiences and viewpoints on why people have had haunting type experiences. We're really full on interested in media engagement at the University of Northampton and trying to get out there to give this fair, neutral overview of, well, these are the skeptical viewpoints and what we found. However, there's a grey area over here where we've got good controls, we've applied that skepticism, we've looked for conventional explanations, but something new seems to be going on. So that's our next step. Those are the directions we need to work towards. That's where we bring in the neuroscience. That's where we bring in everything we've got to try and find out what's going on there. Can we actually discover something new that would tell us more about Psi, if indeed it's genuine? And so, quick overview there of the history of parapsychology, where it's going. I mentioned all the different PhD studies we've got going on. And I'm aware Raven's asleep on my lap at the same time, so I don't know at what point she's going to wake from this quick nap. She's moving now because I've reached the end of the talk. So there we go. I've got books on Amazon. You can check out my website, calamecooper.com. There's my email address there, and follow me on Twitter. I usually give updates of what research we're doing, what's going on. From there, I'm happy to take questions and answers.
Just unmute. Brilliant. Thank you, Cal. What a great overview. And, when you were talking about the reaction of the scientists, it reminded me of one of Bob Yarn's stories where he says the so-called scientist comes up to him and says, even if what you're telling me is true, I wouldn't believe it. And
yes.
It's kind of, scientist? Wait a minute. And so
there are so many anecdotes of that that Stephen Schwartz has told, and a number of other people, where they've been in dialogues with people, and it's published in various formats, so I can name the names, but people like Dan Dennett, for example, he was even at a talk somewhere with Rupert Sheldrake, and Dan was in the audience. And Rupert was saying something that categorically Dan was very much against as a consciousness researcher. And that could have started a whole talk on its own. But there was an instance of Dan with Stephen Schwartz saying, I think he dismissed parapsychology, and Stephen said, well, that's a very sweeping statement. Could you just name one particular study and let's talk about it in depth and break it down as to why it's a bad study, why it's not demonstrating Psi? And his response in this live show, I think it was being recorded on live TV, was, you don't seriously think that I'd read any of that shit, do you? And then went red in the face, realized what he'd said. Some of the people behind the camera started to laugh, then the audience laughed, and realized that you've just destroyed your own argument. You're saying this is bad research, when the next breath you've scoffed at it and, unnecessary cursing, and said, you don't seriously think I would engage with that? You don't think I actually read any of that? Well, then who are you to comment? Becomes the next thing. If you don't know the studies that well, all you can ever offer is a sweeping opinion from your side of things, but it's your side of things not dealing with it. You are looking at something that has an overlap, but you're not looking at these specific anomalies that the parapsychologists or consciousness researchers dealing with it are. And this is the danger, again, that I mentioned of platforms. I've been asked questions when I've been on radio about space science, about biology. I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm not a biologist. And if I don't know something, I'll say that's not for me. I've got colleagues that deal with that, or it's beyond my scope. I don't want to touch anything that I could misrepresent. And so the simple thing is be honest and say you don't know or it's not for you. But point people in the direction of the people that you know do know. Don't try and have a go, because people will see you as an authority and they'll take it as read.
Yeah, Pat, just in the question and answer, asked whether you were aware of, during the pandemic, I don't know if any research had been done on the kind of whether there was an increase in psychic experiences during the COVID pandemic. She was, I think, suggesting I found myself having my strongest experiences during the pandemic. So do you know if those kind of conditions, has there been any research done on that yet?
Well, it's become a big question. So while that was happening, there were social media platforms for the SPR and ASAP, the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena, and other outlets. Chris French wrote an article about it. And I got an old student that came back in to do a PhD, and he's always been interested in ghosts and apparitions. And I said, well, let's look at the lockdown period during COVID, and is there an arguable increase or indeed evidence for the quality of experiences that we see in the early times of the SPR, these very detailed interactions with apparitions. And so he's just started his PhD to look at this and gather data. And his first stepping stones are to look at the literature of, well, here's the rise of spiritualism. Here are these deaths occurring. Here's World War I, and a number of people going to war, dying, people knowing where they are, but not getting a word as to whether they are okay or what happened to them. No funeral process, and then they might have an experience. Then we've got World War II. There's also the Great Depression and many other things. World War II, we have the blackouts and the Blitz and air raid shelters and periods of being in isolation where we're told to, just like we had with stay at home, save lives, and only go shopping if it's an absolute must. And our relatives going to hospital, slight cough, 2 weeks later they're dead, and we didn't get to say goodbye, or they're in care homes. So we know of it. We know it's comparable to some different periods in time. Whether that has any link to better quality or increase in psychic phenomena, spontaneous ones, we don't really know. It might not. And so Aaron's exploring this as a PhD project just to see what comes out of it when he reaches out and asks for people their stories, and also put some surveys together. So it's being done. We don't have any empirical data on it at present. There's just observations.
I mean, I wonder, in our very overstimulated sensory world, particularly in the Western world, where we're continually drawn outside of ourselves, as it were, rather than given space inside of ourselves, whether the lockdown was actually a form of, relative sensory deprivation. So we were no longer so stimulated by stuff that maybe we did start to open up some of the gateways, for more of the inner experience. That would kind of make sense.
Well, we already know, just like the flotation tanks, that when you put yourself in sensory isolation, things are going to happen. Now, if someone suffered a loss and that person lived with you, their items are going to be there. Their perfumes, their tobaccos, their smells are in that house. So many things could trigger an experience that suggests they're just about to walk in the room, or they're stood just behind you, or you thought you've heard them shout your name from upstairs. All the things that follow suggestion and expectancy effects. But what about full-blown apparitions or any other phenomena, or something that someone else not involved in your personal loss can see and experience as well? So those the phenomena that go beyond that anomalistic psychology aspect that then start to breach into parapsychology. So that's really what Aaron's looking at, sifting that wheat from the chaff. What have we got left?
Yeah, cool. Just in the context of like humanity rising, I mean, all this whole broadcast started at the beginning of the lockdown as we were looking at people telling stories who had, visions and insights of a kind of positive post-pandemic world. If we are, let's say, if this domain, or why is this whole domain important, would you say, in the biggest sense of it, for the future of humanity? Why is it important for us to be actually developing this domain more or exploring it more, given the kind of challenges we're all facing right now? in the sense that if we were going to make, the theme of the Science and Consciousness Conference we have coming up in October, November in Yorkshire, where the Pear Lab and stuff is, we called it Making Weird the Norm. Because at the end of last one, we were like, okay, I think we've all proven to each other that basically this is a real dimension of reality. So let's stop trying to prove it, and let's experiment with what would it be like if we just assumed that this was the way things were. How would that change the way we see the world? How would that change the way we show up and behave?
But that was Chris Rowe mentioned that.
Already.
There was it was an introduction to one of James Alcock's books. Now, James Alcock is a sort of a very big skeptic against parapsychology. He wrote the response to Edsel Cardenia's paper with Arthur Ruber, I think it was. And I think Chris and others have mentioned it, where in the introduction to one of James's books, he says, what would the world be like if this phenomena that we're proposing was genuine? What would it be like?
Okay.
And as though it's the reaction to make you think, oh God, that would be a weird world. When actually, no, it would just be this. It's this right now, because this is the world in which people are making these claims. So if these were genuine, it would be no different to right now. It is the world right now. People had this massive assumption that if psychic functioning, extended consciousness were genuine, well, why aren't people winning the lottery every day and getting the numbers right every single day and just using those abilities? Why do we need mobile phones? Can't we just be telepathic with our families all day and they just know? Well, no, the claim that you're making is a big skeptical comeback relates not one bit to the day-to-day experiences that people report. People don't claim that they have the lottery numbers. Not really. There might be some people that claim that and claim they've got abilities, but when they're tested, there's nothing there. They're just making a wild claim. The day-to-day accounts don't claim that. The day-to-day accounts don't claim that people can use telepathy like a telephone. They're hunches, they're feelings that weigh up. And when you put them to a test, when you stick them in controlled settings, we see the numbers speak for themselves. Not on a massive scale, not massively statistically significant, but no better than the rest of psychology studies. They're comparable, and in some cases they are better. So they're very subtle experiences that shine through. For Humanity Rising, this whole idea of, what's their purpose, what's their place, what would they do? There are studies and explorations. Louis Sava looked into it for his PhD of the evolutionary basis for Psy. If we went back to early man, they have hunting and gathering aspects. Precognition can tell us to avoid that path because of the saber-toothed tiger that's going to eat us. Clairvoyance can tell us to walk in the direction of the berries, the nice fruits, the water source, without going miles in the wrong direction and dying because we don't find it. And telepathy could allow us to hunt without the need to make a noise and give it away to whatever it is we're hunting, and many other things. But today's society is full of media, it's full of technology and all kinds of interactions that help us survive and provide us with the food that we need in the supermarkets that actually dull down to a very large extent. So it's barely even noticeable, any Psy, if indeed it is a real thing. And so it has to be a very significant event, not boring or mundane, and you can have boring and mundane Psy events, but something that could be life-threatening or life-changing. You're a twin and you work for an airline and you're serving drinks up there, or you're the pilot and you have this excruciating pain in your arm suddenly. Turns out you're twin when you've landed and you speak to the family, you're able to use the mobile phone. Your twin who works on the ground somewhere has broken their arm. And there are accounts like that, but you don't know until after the fact. But it's some sort of close bond with your social units, your biological units and links. We can see it through that. So if we understood this data more, if we harnessed it more, if we did, put a lot more money into the funding of these kinds of these studies, it would tell us more about these hidden potentials of the mind and what it's capable of. And, later down the line, it might be put to some practical use. They have done within military circumstances, as you mentioned. And I also briefly mentioned with Jessica Utt's talk, where they've tried to look at remote viewing for data gathering and things like that. Even psychokinesis as a weapon towards the enemy. That's where the film The Men Who Stare at Goats came about. It all came from Nina Kalagana's studies looking at her ability to manipulate things. They tested her with trying to stop frog hearts. So in the film, they show this idea of the soldiers trying to stop goats' hearts as well.
Yeah. We're talking to Stanley yesterday. I suggested to him that one of the reasons that it's important to communicate the kind of findings and this research is that as humanity, we've kind of forgotten the nature of our interconnectedness with each other and with the rest of life. And as you start to accept what, you know, a lot of this research is talking about, you can't help but accept that there is a level of interconnectedness between us all that our materialist science has kind of denied, and that our culture and education has really focused on emphasizing our separation and the partness of things as opposed to the relationship between things. And that one of the keys to our survival as humanity is to remember the nature of that interconnectedness. And Stan, he was definitely in agreement with that. And he said, you have to remember that these phenomena are survival traits. So it existed like back then, like you were describing, because we needed it to survive. And my sense is, having been involved in a lot of large-scale attempts with multi-stakeholders to solve complex problems around climate change, etc., is that we are reaching the limits of our rational mind to be able to deal with the complexity of the issues. And when we actually quieten that down and open up our intuitive knowing, we start to access solutions that we could never have thought of ourselves. And it reminds me of David Lukes was telling us, you know, the story of the research they did with the scientists at Imperial who took a little bit of LSD and got breakthroughs in all of their projects that they were working on. And maybe part of the way for us to be able to deal with this massive complexity we all seem to be struggling with right now is to access these other intelligences that will enable solutions to come through that are probably much more aligned with the rest of life than anything we can think up with rationally. I mean, how would you?
There's so many aspects of that where, you know, Freud and Jung and the dabbling with psychedelics and people of that time. I think it was even Thomas Edison, and John Cleese has mentioned it a few times. He's been involved with psychical research and parapsychology through Dean Radin and Ed Kelly and people at the University of Virginia. But I think he mentions Edison, how Edison would sit in a chair with a metal plate the side of the chair, and he'd have some metal ball bearings in his hand, and he'd fall asleep in the chair. And as he'd do that, then his hand would let go of the ball bearings, and they'd fall on the plate and create a big, you know, bang and clatter. But he was going into what's called the hypnagogic state. As you're starting to go to sleep, you're entering an altered state. All this vivid imagery starts to come to you as the central nervous system temporarily shuts down to allow you to sleep and not sleepwalk and hurt yourself. But that imagery is coming forward, where you might dream about walking and kicking a curb and your leg kicks out, and that it's testing that nervous system. But that imagery is really vivid. And so he was doing it to get good ideas to come forward from this imagery in this altered state, that if he's starting to get them, the ball bearings will drop and make a noise and wake him instantly up out of that state, so he could quickly write down those ideas, harnessing the altered state. You know, as well, there was a lot of early scholars that would probably drink every moment they got up through to midday and the moment they went back to sleep. So alcohol in the system all the time, and sometimes that's giving them good ideas for their writing and thoughts. Not that it's a good idea, because, you know, the too much of it is causing damage to them. But John Lilly was the same. He was using the flotation tanks with mixtures of LSD and ketamine. He'd spend about 4 to 5 hours at a time floating with this stuff in his system. It eventually destroyed him, but he was an incredibly intelligent guy that was, you know, it was giving him access to thoughts that other people wouldn't have, that were, you know, just, wow, where are you getting these ideas from, him and marrying them up to the science that he was studying.
Yeah, brilliant. Good. Well, Callum, I'm going to say thanks very much for taking the time with us. Just to let you know, anyone who wasn't on the call yesterday, we've kind of sandwiched this week in between the first Science and Consciousness event we did at Broughton last year and the one we're doing end of October, beginning of November. I mean, as I've said, and I'll send you the details again, if you or any of your students want to come up to that, it'd be great to have you with us. We've got, particularly like Peter Fenwick has been involved in some of this research that we do, where we're working with the random event generators that are picking up significant order in the random structure when somebody dies. So they've done this research in the ICUs in Spain and are now taking it into hospices in Scotland. So that whole community of researchers will be there looking at that, which is just reminding us that the nature of the dying process is more than a physical process, because there's nothing physical connected to the REGs, you know, when they're in that room with people and things. So if anybody is interested in knowing more about that, for this week we're running a 10% discount on the Science and Consciousness event as well. So feel free. Here's the card I put up yesterday as well. There's the code in there, SCICONS. So that's Science and Consciousness, SCICONS 10. If you put that in on the Ubiquity site, you'll get 10% off the rate for the program. It'd be great to have people, who've been here this week in the program as well, to build on it, to build on these conversations we're having this week too. And a number of the people who are with us this week are going to be at Broughton in England next autumn as well. Roger Nelson, I think, is now deciding he's almost definitely going to come because the whole of that research group is going to be there. So it's going to be a really cool collection of people. So it'd be great to have you, Callum, and any of your students.
Absolutely.
We'll have Murphy working, the old mechanical random cascade that they had at Princeton. We'll have him working by then as well. So that'll be fun. And Diane asking, can we join by Zoom? We might well have a streaming option for it, Diane, as well, as we had last year. Nice to see. She's still. Oh no! Time to wake up.
Why?
So,
I love that. She woke up and her first comment was, "Why?"
Why? Yeah,
why?
Good question. Always worth asking.
Why? Oh.
So, Jim, time to hand back to you. Thanks again, Cal, for your time and the brilliant work that you're doing, and just fantastic, even with all the resistance and all the challenges you're facing, to keep going with all of that.
That's a whole talk in itself. I'll be doing that in Leicester this weekend, looking at the psychology of disbelief. So the book I mentioned by Craig Weiler, Psy Wars, I'll be talking about that and what my PhD student is doing, looking at that in terms of cyber psychology and parapsychologist's data on the internet. Why the resistance, why the attacks, and often from people that don't ever want to identify themselves as well. What's going on there? What's the psychology to that?
Yeah, wow, brilliant.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Callum. Thank you, Peter. It reminds me of Thomas Kuhn's work on the paradigms of science, that people don't believe what they believe because of the facts. They believe certain facts because of the paradigm that they have in their head. And so what you're encountering, Callum, is what, Galileo back, 600 years ago with the telescope. The people didn't have the paradigm that enabled them to, look through the telescope and see the planets and the stars and so forth and so on. It's an extraordinary thing about the human being that we are controlled through what we believe rather than what's true. And so, like Peter, I commend your stalwart fortitude of continuing to keep on keeping on, man, in the face of such myopic, provincial, bigoted thinking. And, when you think that even organizations like TED and Wikipedia that are supposed to be honoring, free thought and free expression and the people's voice, have sort of banned this kind of work. It gives you a sense of how far we have to go to establish true science as a method of inquiry that seeks, without paradigms, to interpret the data as it emerges and allows the facts to speak to themselves. So, Callum, hats off to you. And it's been wonderful to have your daughter sleeping sweetly on your lap during your presentation. It's a beautiful juxtaposition of courage and innocence.
Well, she wanted the Gruffalo. She brought the Gruffalo in. I said, I've just got to do this talk first, baby. And so she sat and started listening. And within 5 minutes, I think my voice was asleep. Didn't matter whether I read the Gruffalo or gave a history of parapsychology. Both were going to send it to sleep.
Good one. Well, thank you. And thank you, Peter. And that brings us to a close for today. But this has been a marvelous history, everyone, of how laborious the struggle is to get people to recognize the innate qualities they have, all of us have, very naturally, because we're conscious beings in a conscious universe. You're all welcome to join the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box, and we'll see you all again tomorrow for day 3 of our 5-day program on science and consciousness.
Yeah, Jim, maybe just to remind people what that is the tarot experience in VR using random event generators. So be prepared for a trip tomorrow.
Only on Humanity Rising, everyone. Thanks so much. Be well. See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.